This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, our top stories. Police chiefs have told the Home Secretary they need more money to combat the rise in violent knife crime. A father has been jailed for at least 16 years for planning an acid attack on his own 3-year-old son as part of a custody battle with the child's mother. And a man with autism who swore allegiance to Islamic State has been jailed for planning to drive a van into Shoppers on Oxford Street in central London. Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour or so then, we'll see what's making the headlines with City AM's comment editor Rachel Cunliffe and the writer Benedict Spence. Lovely to see you both. So to the front pages then, let's start with The Guardian. The Home Secretary Sajid Javid is set to clash with the Prime Minister, the paper says, after he backs demands by police for an emergency £15 million grant to fund a surge of officers to fight knife crime. The Eye also leading on knife crime, reporting that Mr Javid has clashed with the Prime Minister over whether more police resources are needed to tackle the issue. The Mirror too leading on the Home Secretary's clash with Theresa May over knife crime, the epidemic as they call it. The Sun asks, when will it stop, referring to the spree of stabbings. The Times leads with an investigation which has found that a third of British billionaires have moved to tax havens over the past decade. The Telegraph goes with Brexit, reporting that cabinet ministers are already resigning themselves to a defeat in next week's meaningful vote on Theresa May's Brexit deal. Financial Times reports that following the Salisbury poisonings a year ago, stricter rules are to be introduced to slow down the fast-tracking of UK visas for wealthy investors from countries such as Russia. And meanwhile, the Daily Mail reports that a new diet can reverse diabetes. The Metro has word of the break-in at the Glasgow home of Leicester City football manager Brendan Rodgers, in which his wife and young stepdaughter were terrorised. So Rachel Cunliffe, Benedict Spence are here. You want to start with Brexit, the Daily Telegraph. How are those talks going in Brussels then?
Well, not that well, according to the headline, which I really like on this. I got very excited. Cabinet resigned. I was like, who's resigned to Brexit deal defeat? Less exciting, but still, the story is that Theresa May is having her second meaningful vote, or MV2, as they're calling it in Westminster, which is going to be on Tuesday. She lost the last one by a historic 230 votes. She is expected to lose this one by 100 votes, which, OK, she's narrowing the gap. Still not great. And a lot of the hopes of number 10 were hinging on these talks with the EU in Brussels. Geoffrey Cox, our Attorney General, has headed over there, and so has our Brexit Secretary, and these talks collapsed without progress. Basically, the EU hasn't budged at all, as many people said that they would not.
I mean, quite simply, there isn't the time available to the Prime Minister to get any sort of deal through. So I think all that leaves is the possibility of an extension to Article 50, which actually won't change anything per se, because I can't really see what is going to change in her approach or what will change in the EU's negotiating position. So where then does that leave us? A general election, a second referendum? I think it's got to be one of the two, possibly both, because ultimately I don't see how this stalemate changes as things currently stand, unless, of course, there's some drastic change in the EU's policy, which I don't think anybody can particularly envisage. So, to coin a phrase, or to just steal the phrase, nothing has changed. Everything is exactly the same as it has been for the best part of 2 years now, and it looks like we are going to head into the extension of Article 50, and then probably it will go to the country in some form or another.
And the difficulty, I suppose, for the European Union is that the Good Friday Agreement is internationally binding. We are a signatory to it, and there's kind of no way of getting around that. Is that part of the problem?
I think there probably would be ways around it if the EU were prepared to be slightly more flexible than they are being, and if
but it would be wording, wouldn't it? It would be a legal fudge that you're asking for, effectively.
Well, the UK is asking for more than a legal fudge. They're asking for legally binding language. The EU has said in letters that they don't expect the backstop to come into force, and they expect it to be temporary. That's a good word, expect. It can mean a lot of things. Obviously, the EU is also representing one of its members, which is the Republic of Ireland, which is still a member, whereas we are in the process of leaving. You got a bit ahead of yourself there with general elections and second vote, which may well happen. But I'm more interested in what happens when Theresa May's vote fails next week, we've got on Wednesday a vote on taking no deal off the table, and then on Thursday a vote on extending Article 50. It's going to be really interesting how Parliament reacts to that. I think seeing if MPs are actually prepared to vote against a no deal, which doesn't mean that there won't be a no-deal Brexit. It means that they're taking that negotiating option off the table. Whether they will actually vote to extend Article 50, the Commons maths there is changing all the time, and that's going to be really interesting.
So what do you think is going to happen then?
I have no idea. I gave up predicting anything when I sort of thought that, you know, Brexit wouldn't happen and Hillary Clinton would win the election. I don't do predictions anymore.
How much money do you want to bet that there will be a general election, or that we will have another referendum before we leave the European Union?
Yeah, you probably.
Yeah.
Probably one of the two.
Only slightly ahead of myself. Only slightly.
And then we can look forward to MV3, presumably, can we? Meaningful Vote 3.
Sounds like a rock band, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Or a really bad sequel to an action film.
Yeah, the Metro has also got pictures there of, you know, people looking miserable. Robust talks on Brexit fail to provide a breakthrough. Obviously, you know, Geoffrey Cox is back now. We'll see what happens.
Oh, he's got some great language in this. He says both sides have exchanged strong, robust views, and we're now on to the real discussions. So you know what that means, and it's politicians' language for it was a disaster.
Yeah, I think he was talking to our very own Michelle Clifford at the time, probably, wasn't he? Let's move on to knife crime, shall we? Obviously keeping an eye on Brexit matters. Fascinating week next week, certainly, as you're suggesting. And for Theresa May, 230 to 100 MPs. She might class this as progress, but we will see. To The Guardian, then, the meeting today between the Home Secretary and police chiefs, and the result is that he seems to have sided with the police, whereas Theresa May has suggested that police resources and knife crime don't necessarily have anything to do with each other.
Well, it's a difficult one because it's obviously a very important issue. It's at the top of the agenda and this has to be dealt with. And clearly there is a lack of confidence in the Prime Minister's stance within her own party as well as in the police. But the police has never really had much confidence in Theresa May. The difficult thing, of course, given Sajid Javid's ambition, given his past, is it's very difficult to see this as anything other than long-term, quite a cynical ploy of trying to win round certainly other members of his party and the general public with one eye on a leadership bid. Of course, when times are difficult, people always do tend to turn to more authoritarian attitudes. People are very keen on, law and order. That does become a bit of a focus for people, especially when children are being stabbed on the streets. So you can understand entirely. On the one hand, yeah, absolutely. I think he's probably right that there does need to be a lot more resources put into the police, although perhaps one could also say a change in priorities in the police themselves needs to happen. But on the other hand, like I said, it's difficult to separate that away from Sajid Javid, given his ambitions in that field.
I think the Prime Minister really did not do herself any favours on Monday when she claimed that there was no direct correlation between the cuts in police numbers and the rise in crime. When she was Home Secretary, she cut numbers by 20,000, and it's clear that there is a correlation. It may not be the main cause, it may be much more complicated than that. I think cuts to social services and youth services come into it a lot. So to perhaps do changes in police powers and indeed what we believe are crimes. That has changed. But to just claim that wasn't a factor, I think, was politically a very bad move from her. I also think it's interesting that, aside from Brexit, the issues that Theresa May really, really doesn't do very well on are Home Office ones, because she was at the Home Office for a very long time. She has a Home Office mentality. We saw this with the use of cannabis, medicinal cannabis, for children with very severe medical conditions. We saw it with Windrush, with immigration. She is not flexible on things that she considers her beat, and it really damages her.
And the backdrop, while these political discussions are underway, the Mirror, the Sun, leading on yet another stabbing, which led to the death of a young person tonight, Leighton, in East London. The difficulty, I suppose, for Theresa May, she raised the point in Prime Minister's questions today, is that austerity was imposed because of difficulties in the management of the economy, which happened to fall on Labour's watch because of the financial crisis. So the eye to Javid and May clashed on knife violence. Will more money be forthcoming, I suppose, if that is now the demand?
I don't see how it can't be, ultimately. As inflexible as the Prime Minister is, I think there will be pressure building behind the scenes to get her to change her mind. And, we have actually seen that she can be forced if enough threatening goes on behind the scenes.
When has she been forced to change
She's
her
done
mind?
many U-turns on many things throughout the Brexit negotiations. Don't get me wrong, she'll take it as far as she possibly can, much further than perhaps she would like to. But that's not to say that she can't be forced back onto these things. And I think she will have to recognise, especially when the issue of children being stabbed, children in general, is always a very emotive subject. And even Theresa May can't be completely unaware of that even if she disagrees with what the police are saying, which is that this is linked to austerity, ultimately the public may not care about that. She needs to be seen to be doing something, and just sitting there and going, it's nothing to do with that, that's not the problem. People might say, well, that's fair enough. But what are you going to do to deal with the problem? Because
and
what you're currently doing
as well, not just police, youth services. Our correspondents were being told today, youth services is really what people also want, a role model, a mentoring, perhaps.
And if people are carrying knives, if young people are carrying knives because they feel afraid and that's their only way to defend themselves, it's their only way that they can feel safe, that is another issue as well. And that is a kind of direct result of austerity and cuts to local councils.
OK. Plenty more still to come in the next part of our programme, why millions of people have only a bit more than 24 hours to renew their passports. I've got time. We will explain more in just a moment. Yes, go now. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Rachel Cunliffe and Benedict Spence. Welcome back to both of you. To City AM, Trump stumped the headline. The US trade deficit, the paper says, has hit a 10-year low, and the president's policies are backfiring, therefore.
Who would have thought protectionism sometimes backfires and isn't great? Basically, everyone, the entire global economy, thought that. Trump went ahead with it anyway. His trade war, his tariffs on China, his threats of tariffs on Europe, on Germany and on the UK. And his aim all along has been to narrow the US trade deficit because he thinks that if the US is buying more things from other countries than it is selling, then it is losing in some way. Actually, it's not. Its consumers are getting access to cheaper, better products and a better choice of products. Everyone benefits. Maybe basic economic theory doesn't quite get through to the president. Anyway, it hasn't worked. The trade deficit is down 12% since 2008. It's at a 12-year low. It's at $621 billion.
So what, they're importing even more goods, is what you're saying?
They're importing that much more than they are exporting.
OK.
And part of this is because of the protectionist policies. As Trump has made it harder to buy US goods, other countries have retaliated. Part of it is also because of his tax cuts. He's made it cheaper for US companies to import. So, you know, that's a good thing. But obviously, it kind of doesn't work with his whole making America great again, jobs, we're going to bring back jobs, we're going to stop China from beating us, all that rhetoric. It has backfired spectacularly.
Well, I think it's very interesting. Of course, the whole point about the tax cuts is, I think the real kicker is, of course, that, you know, having renegotiated NAFTA and all these things, it is now much easier for US consumers than it was, say, 2 or 3 years ago to be buying all of these foreign goods. But I think a lot of what it always comes down to with Mr. Trump is very little about the actual the policy or the thought process that goes behind that. It's a lot more to do with the image. He is a showman, and it's a lot more about the rhetoric and saying that I'm doing more for America, saying I'm bringing back jobs, saying I'm being tough on China. Because if you are the average person, you read the news and you aren't necessarily an expert on economic policy, then actually it might well appear that things are going very well because you've got your tax cuts, you've got more dollars in your pocket, and he is being tough on China, being tough on Canada. Forget, he only has to do this, realistically, for another 18 months or so, because he's focused on re-election. If he gets over that hurdle, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. That's all he has to do. So, really, is this a bad thing for Donald Trump? I don't think so, necessarily. For the United States more generally, I think you're right. This isn't going to help them in the long term, but why is that going to hurt him? He doesn't care about that.
Can I just flag a headline that we ran a year ago?
Oh, yes.
Since we never get to do my paper.
This is very good.
It's on the City AM front page. A year ago, when he first introduced these tariffs, we ran the headline, "Hit the Chevy with a levy, tax your whiskey and rye." And that was like one of my proudest moments in journalism.
Oh, good.
Anyway,
good
moving on.
Let's go to The Guardian. Rise in populist rhetoric. There we go. Revealed the surge, they say.
Well, on the subject, it's like on the subject of the president talking the talk. Yes, this is from The Guardian, that supposedly more political speeches now involve or include rhetoric or language that is more geared towards appealing to the sort of the dispossessed and the disconnected in society rather than society more as a whole. And I don't think...
Do they include in that nationalism, then, do you think?
I suppose that must include nationalism, but also, I suppose, on the other side of the spectrum, it's going to include socialism as well. well. It's, I mean, as we've tried to ascertain what is populism, it's a very broad spectrum. It just basically means whatever you dislike. As long as you're in the liberal centrist, then anything that you don't like is a little bit to the right of the Kaiser or slightly to the left.
They define it here as framing politics as a battle between the will of ordinary people and the corrupt, self-serving elite. So
yes, but it must be said, you can frame that from any perspective. You can say that that is politics.
Just in general, you're an elite.
Well, yes, I would, but but no, I don't think that this is particularly. I mean, it's interesting that they've bothered to do a study on it, but is anybody particularly surprised by this finding? I think we can see the evidence for this all around us.
We've only got 30 seconds left to do our final story. Do not worry, which is the scramble for a passport on a story we don't fully understand, I have to say. But the whole point is 3 weeks to Brexit.
We don't understand it, but we are all very quickly panicking about it. Having read it a few minutes ago.
It says 3.5 million Brits will not comply with rules and so might not be able to enter the EU.
You're supposed to have 6 months on your passport in order to travel. There seems to be a carryover system, which means that actually after a no-deal Brexit, people with up to 15 months left on their passport could be denied entry. It's that bit we don't understand.
Basically, check it. You can check it online.
But that seems
seems
like almost most of us, probably.
Rachel's fine. She's got an EU passport, but I'm going to Morocco forever now. So
OK, fine. That's all right then. Good. We will look into that story in more detail. And we'll...
Elite.
Indeed. He did say he agreed with you, actually, as well. We'll see you at 11:30. Thank you. To the weather. Hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour then, we'll see what's making the headlines with City AM's comment editor, Rachel Cunliffe, and the writer, Benedict Spence. Welcome to both of you, good to see you. So let's check out the front pages to start with then. In The Guardian, the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, is at odds with the Prime Minister after he backs demands by police for an emergency £15 million grant to fund a surge of officers to fight knife crime. The Eye, also leading on knife crime, reporting that Mr Javid has clashed with the Prime Minister over whether more police resources are needed to tackle the issue. The Daily Mirror too leads on the Home Secretary's disagreement with Theresa May over knife crime, while reporting on the killing in Leighton in East London. The Sun asking, when will it stop referring to the spree of stabbings? The Times leads with an investigation which has found that a third of British billionaires have moved to tax havens over the past decade. The Telegraph goes with Brexit, reporting that cabinet ministers are already resigning themselves to a defeat in next week's meaningful vote on Theresa May's Brexit deal. Financial Times reporting that following the Salisbury poisonings a year ago, stricter rules are to be introduced to slow down the fast-tracking of UK visas for wealthy investors from countries such as Russia. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail reporting that indeed a new diet can reverse diabetes. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were reportedly shocked after visiting a home where a landlord forced a family to live in squalor. That is according to The Express. The Metro has news of the break-in at the Glasgow home of Leicester City football manager Brendan Rodgers, in which his wife and young stepdaughter were apparently terrorised. And The Star has a story about a former soap star and celebrity Big Brother contestant comparing herself to Michael Jackson. So Rachel Cunliffe, Benedict Spence are here. To the Daily Telegraph, a resignation that the second meaningful vote will also be a defeat for Theresa May.
Yes, this is the story. Basically, we're in the build-up. We're in the final stretch now to Brexit, or are we? Who knows? The Prime Minister believes that she has got the number of votes that will oppose her deal down to just 100, but nonetheless, there are still supposedly 100 votes still to be gained. So it doesn't look like she's going to pass her deal. And then that leaves her with the next vote, which is to vote on preventing the possibility of a no deal. And, of course, it looks like the Commons will pass that. Now, if that then happens, we go on to the third vote, which is on extending Article 50. So we are pretty much where we were 2 years ago, in that it doesn't look like we're leaving the European Union anytime soon, because there isn't a plan in place, and we haven't actually planned this all very well at all. Are we going to go into this letter now that's just...
Well, yes, indeed, exactly. A letter to members of the lobby saying that, actually, they're still trying to work out the backstop. Obviously, the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, has had what can only be seen as failed talks with Brussels to get them to persuade their mind on the backstop, but they are going to work together to try and work out alternative arrangements with 3 advisory groups.
So this is really interesting because all of the news coming out of Brussels was that the talks had not just gone badly but completely collapsed. I think if we've got the Sun, page 2, has
we can get to that.
New cocks up as their headline, 11th hour, and it really is the 11th hour now, Brexit talks collapse in bitter clash. We had very strong words from the EU saying that absolutely no movement was going to be made on the backstop, and it was kind of accepted that progress wasn't going to be made. And now we have this letter to the lobby that says the UK and the EU have agreed to consider a joint work stream to develop alternative arrangements. Now, that isn't exactly a breakthrough, but that does sound a little bit warmer than what we've got in the papers.
It almost sounds like the European Union have been spinning. Good Lord, who would have thought that they were telling us one thing and actually doing another?
Well, are you saying that spinning happens on both sides of the channel?
Oh, good Lord, no, surely not. That's not a thing. But I mean, it must be said, it must be said for a very long time, the British government is the one that's borne the brunt, certainly from the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, for the ones that have caused this as an issue. But ultimately, were we to leave and for there to then be a hard border, it wouldn't go particularly well for the EU either, because, of course, they have been so very obstinate and giving the impression of being very steadfast on not being prepared to negotiate on certain things. Well, then, let's say in those set of circumstances we then crash out and there were to be a hard border, it wouldn't go down especially well, I think, in Ireland. And that, of course, the EU has to look to its own. Ireland is still a member of the European Union, and it would be a great disservice to the Irish people for them to allow it as much as the UK government allowing it to happen to Northern Ireland.
And even in Northern Ireland, apparently businesses are beginning to put a lot of pressure on the DUP, that Arlene Foster now is feeling that pressure about no deal for both sides of the Irish border.
I think in the Northern Ireland, definitely. I think in the Republic of Ireland, it's not quite got to that stage yet. I think Leo Varadkar is still enjoying a lot of support. He's seeming like he's tough. I think that there is sort of sentiment that the Irish are not going to let themselves be bullied by the British. There's a lot of sort of historic sentiment coming up there. So it's not like the people of Ireland are united in the same way that people of Britain are not united. Just to go back to the Sun, I've got a Brexiteer minister, it doesn't say who, says, lose on Tuesday and everything will be expletive. I can't see how we go forwards with a softer Brexit imposed on us without the party splitting. So I think even with this letter, even with the idea that the EU may be softening somewhat, that is not going to do anything to heal divisions in the Tory party. That is quite strong language.
Yes, I don't know that you can say the EU is softening, because this letter seems to imply that there will be an implementation period. If there's a transition period, then therefore there has to be a withdrawal deal, which means maybe this only works if MPs finally sign up to Theresa May's deal.
Anyway, implementation period.
Yes, sorry, transition period. You know, that slow movement into leaving. But as you say, we'll wait and see what happens.
Into death.
Yes, exactly. For Theresa May, though, 230 MPs voted down the withdrawal deal in the first instance. If it's only 100 this time, I mean, it's a march towards progress.
She might get there by meaningful vote 3.
Meaningful vote 3, yeah.
Who knows?
MV3, are they calling it already?
Well, all of
we
us
don't
the
know.
will to live.
Anyway, busy week next week. We'll see what happens, certainly. Meantime, the government's big problem this week is knife crime. We've had another killing today in Leighton in East London. And Sajid Javid meeting police chiefs, chief constables and others as well to thrash out what needs to be done.
It's actually made more of the front pages than Brexit has, and rightly so, especially with that other killing today. And I think this shows the danger of the government taking its eye off domestic issues and focusing on Brexit at the expense of all else, whether it's because of cuts to police numbers, and it's clear that there is a link. Even the Prime Minister herself finally admitted that, and that's what Sajid Javid is calling for here, more money for the police to tackle knife crime, or whether it is a range of other issues. It's clear that those other issues haven't been tackled, and actually crime matters a lot more to people in their everyday life than Brexit does.
And meantime, a lot of the papers are focusing on the fact that Sajid Javid seems to be agreeing with the police and not with Theresa May. And there you ask the question, why is he doing that? Yes,
Mr Javid is clearly setting out his stall in favour of the police. And, of course, when it comes to the issue of knife crime, one is always going to look to the police to be the ones to solve that issue. The Prime Minister has been quite, shall we say, robust in what her views are on the issue. And in doing so, Mr Javid is certainly putting himself, I think, in the stronger position in that ultimately only putting more money into the police is going to be the only thing that really alleviates certainly public sentiment when it comes to these things. And I think we've got to look at this through the prism of Sajid Javid having one eye on his career, certainly thinking that, you know, being tough on crime but also giving money to the police, that's going to go down well with core Tory voters and members of the party.
And he's not the only minister who is acting tough at the moment, especially on knife crime. We had Gavin Williamson, who is the Defence Secretary, basically saying, send in the tanks. So
it's a step up from telling them to just go away. So about the Russians.
Also,
knife crime.
Everyone's putting their CV in to be leader of the Tory party. Who knows?
Yes, and they are using what is a very tragic set of events in order to further their own careers. But then again, that is politics.
Yes, indeed. Well, I suppose Theresa May might need proof that reducing resources leads to an increase in knife crime, but Sajid Javid seems to be certainly accepting that, doesn't he? Let's move on to the Financial Times. Trade and complexity. Tell me more.
I will try and explain this. This is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a huge infrastructure project that the Chinese government is undertaking to essentially rebuild the Silk Road. It's a big trade and infrastructure project across Asia and Europe. The Italian government, which is a coalition of two populist parties, one on the left and one on the right, is split over this. The left-wing populists have said, yes, let's open up to China and be China's gateway into Europe. The right-wing populists have, however, responded to the US government and Donald Trump saying, maybe you don't want to do it. So this is basically the US and China, their geopolitical battle playing out within the Italian government.
I mean, it is also a large part of this is looking at the complexities of populism sort of as a phenomenon in populist governments. Lots of people sort of view the Italian government as some sort of unified entity. It's not. It's unified in its dislike of the European Union, and that's just about it. Ultimately, as you've said, it comes down to which side you want to take. Is it China or Russia and the US? Italy's economy is in a very disastrous situation. It needs an influx of capital from somewhere. It needs something to change. It's tried going to the EU with this revised budget and it's hit a brick wall. Now it's looking elsewhere to somehow try to stimulate its economy. And it's finding itself being caught between the US and China. And that is a very difficult thing for them because ultimately Italy has something like 10% unemployment, much higher amongst young people. There's a lot of discontent, which is, of course, why there is a populist government in place. Political crises are not new in Italy. What is perhaps more concerning is that the Movimento Cinque Stelle, the Five Star Movement, which are the ones that are in favour of the Chinese deal, they were the left-wing ones. They were the ones that were the senior partners, as it were, in this coalition. They got a far larger percentage of the vote at the last general election. They now no longer hold all the cards in that the junior partners, the Lega, formerly the Lega Nord, basically a fascist party, they have much more goodwill from the Italian people. They are seen as being much more accomplished, much more professional. And there is no question that Matteo Salvini has stolen a march on his coalition partners with these sort of whistle-stop tours around Europe, around Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, sort of fomenting this coalition of what they call coalition of the sovereigns to take on the EU, but also very pro-Russia, very pro-Trump, and very staunchly against China. The battle lines have been drawn in this, and often with European politics, as Italy goes, much of Europe then follows.
Yeah, and we saw, didn't we, with that bridge collapse, there is rotting infrastructure, the need for the extra cash, people not paying their taxes properly, not getting the tax revenues in. So it's all serious stuff for Italy's economy, certainly.
Absolutely.
Plenty more still to come in the next part of our programme, a different way to burn calories. We'll tell you about the adult film stars who formed their own cycling club. Do I dare look? I'm not sure I do. OK, it's OK. OK, back in a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Rachel Cunliffe and Benedict Spence. Welcome back to both of you. So, City AM, Trump stumped. The US trade deficit hits a 10-year high as the president's policies backfire. His protectionist policies, presumably, you're talking about there.
His protectionist policies that were going to make America great again and lower this trade deficit. Now, Trump is interested...
Explain the trade deficit for us, first of all.
Trump believes that trade is a zero-sum game. So a trade deficit is, does your country buy more from other countries than it sells to other countries? And Trump believes that if it does, then that deficit is something that you need to eliminate because you are losing and other countries are winning. In fact, your country is also winning. Trade benefits everyone. Yes, there are losers, but in general, consumers get access to a wider range of goods, and that is a positive thing. He doesn't seem to understand this. A big part of his campaign was about getting rid of this deficit, particularly with China. China is seen as an unfair competitor. So,
in order to support American jobs, it has to be said.
In order to support American jobs, although there is a lot of evidence that says that if you try and do this, then some jobs may be protected, but others in the supply chains will be affected. And in fact, we have seen that happening with, say, steel tariffs. Steel manufacturers have been doing very well, but American industries, American jobs where steel is used have been hit by them.
Harley-Davidson as well is another one.
Regardless if you think that the protectionist policies are positive, they haven't worked. The American trade deficit is at its highest since 2008. It's up 12% by then, and it kind of is pretty bad for Trump, especially the week after he comes back from North Korea without a deal, having claimed that he would make this amazing deal and that he had the easy fixes to all of America's geopolitical problems. He hasn't. He's failed, and the American economy is suffering as a result.
You do very well as his trade secretary. Do you have any ties to Russia? Because if you do, you've got the job.
No,
frankly, I think that's it in a nutshell.
Yes.
But the next story, if we can move on to that.
Yes, we can. Yes,
Because I have nothing to add to that. She said everything I would say and more.
I was going to ask a question, I've completely forgotten what it was. So
You
there
can
we
tell
are.
that she works for a business newspaper.
I have that effect on people.
Exactly. No, I was going to say, actually, very quickly on that,
Sure.
is that the never-ending electoral cycle for American politics, you know, you get chosen as a candidate, that takes ages, you know, you then fight the next election. He hasn't got that long to hold on.
No, he
already
doesn't.
fighting the
It's
next
true.
one.
He is already essentially running for his re-election campaign. We've seen the tweets about, you know, Pocahontas and all that, about, you know, taking snipes at all of his opponents. Ultimately, Trump doesn't need this to work out for him, you know, de facto. He just
As long as he
needs
still
it.
shouts
As long as it
about
looks like it's going
long as the
very
American
well.
economy
This is
doesn't
the
crash
thing.
spectacularly
Yeah,
before the
before then, it's all about the show. And as long as the show goes on, he can get away with this sort of thing. Ultimately, the policy doesn't matter.
OK. Right, lovely, thank you.
We will
on
then move on
that.
to the
We'll
next
all remember what we're
subject.
trying to talk about. Let's move on to this then. Anti-Semitism row pits young Democrats against their leaders. Staying with America, what's happened in
Well,
this
it is very interesting. Again, slightly to go back to Trump, say as long as the rhetoric just keeps coming out, the show will go on. You actually wrote a very good column in City AM a couple of weeks ago about Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is not the focus of this story, but how she can just sort of say things that don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. But as long as the show it looks right, she can just carry on doing it. Well, the same can be said for this woman here, Ilhan Omar, who has been, she's a new congresswoman, and she's been accused of anti-Semitism, I think referring to, she criticised Israel and the influence that Israel supposedly has in US life, and she tweeted something about, you know, it being all about the Benjamins. She apologised at the time, but now she's been caught out being a little bit more anti-Semitic, and this time just point blank has refused to do it. And I mean, it's interesting so much. We focus on anti-Semitism on the left in this country. Obviously, the Labour Party is in the grip of a real difficult situation there. It's also happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And the question is, how much can you just stick your head in the sand and pretend that these things aren't happening? We've already seen in the Labour Party the lengths that they will go to, just almost to pretend that the issue doesn't exist. And what we are now going to see is how does the Democratic Party deal with this in the US? Because ultimately, this is not a good look for the very big on intersectional, on minorities, the new look Democratic Party to have a Senate, to have a congresswoman, who is openly saying such controversial things and not apologising.
Yes, I mean, Labour would dispute they're doing nothing. We need to move on because we've got 30 seconds left. If you don't mind, I know you've got something to say about that. This one. We're not sleazy riders, insists the head of Porn Stars Cycling Club.
This is my favourite story that I've come across today.
Story about village bicycles.
The Porn Peddlers Cycling Club is a cycling club which describes itself as a ramshackle bunch of cycling enthusiasts who happen to work in and around the UK adult entertainment industry. Great, healthy exercise, wonderful. And they've been, they may be disaffiliated from British cycling. No, they've had their membership revoked by British Cycling, who think that maybe they're sending the wrong message. I think this is a great message. Cycling is sexy. Maybe more people will take it up.
I mean, bringing cycling into disrepute, the most doped sport on earth. Come on.
OK. Thank you both very much, Steve, Benedict and Rachel. We will see you soon. Thank you. Let's check out the weather.